The call came through at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that smelled like rain and regret. I'd been with the Louisiana State Police for 12 years, but nothing prepared me for what waited in Marais Noir. My name is Detective Cubido Landry. Yes, like the town, no relation, and I specialize in cold cases that turn hot. The brass sent me because the local sheriff, a man named Boudreau, had gone silent after reporting something that made even the dispatcher's voice shake when she relayed it to me. "Body found in the old Melançon sugar mill," she'd said. "Sheriff says you need to see it yourself. Says it's arranged." The drive from Baton Rouge took 3 hours through roads that GPS forgot existed. Spanish moss hung from cypress trees like nature's crime scene tape. And the deeper I drove into Terrebonne Parish, the more my radio crackled with static until finally dying altogether near mile marker 47. Marais Noir sits where the bayou swallows the land, a town of maybe 300 souls that most maps don't bother marking. The kind of place where French surnames date back to before Louisiana was American, where people still leave offerings at crossroads, and where everyone knows which houses to avoid after dark. I'd heard stories, of course. Every cop in Louisiana has. The town that refused to let the interstate through in '72. The place where census takers always came back with different numbers. Where the Catholic Church closed in '98 after Father Hebert disappeared, leaving only his shoes, filled with marsh water, at the altar. The welcome sign was rusted through in places, but I could make out the population count. 297. Someone had spray painted over it recently. 298 in fresh white paint that gleamed in my headlights. Sheriff Boudreau met me at the town limits, standing beside his cruiser with its lights off. He was younger than his voice suggested on the phone, maybe 35, with the kind of tired that comes from seeing things you can't explain to your wife at dinner. "Detective Landry," he said, not offering his hand. "Before we go any further, there's things you need to know. Rules." I've been prepared for jurisdictional pushback, small-town politics, the usual dance. But the way he said, "rules," made my coffee-sick stomach tighten. "This town, it's got ways," he continued, glancing at the tree line like something might be listening. "Old ways. You follow them, you might leave with answers. You don't." He spat tobacco juice into the darkness. "Well, we've already got one body. Don't need two." The crickets had stopped singing. In Louisiana, summer. That's never a good sign. "Tell me about these rules, Sheriff." He pulled out a piece of paper, yellowed and soft with age, like it had been handled by many hands before mine. The paper felt older than it looked, brittle like dried snakeskin. Under the dome light of Boudreau's cruiser, I read, "For those who walk Marais Noir after dark. Between sunset and sunrise, do not acknowledge anyone who calls your name unless you can see their feet. The Melançon sugar mill counts its dead at 3:33 a.m. If you hear the grinding, count to 43 in French. No other language will do. Should you encounter Madame Trosclair on the road, tell her the year. She forgets, and forgetting makes her hungry. Never follow the fireflies past the iron fence at Beauregard Cemetery. They are not fireflies. If your shadow moves without you, spit 3 times and recite any Bible verse backwards. Psalms work best. The old families, Melançon, Trosclair, Arsenault, Broussard, have the right of way on all roads after midnight. Pull over, engine off, eyes down. Do not photograph the trees with faces. They remember. I looked up at Boudreau. In 12 years of police work, I'd seen plenty of small-town superstition, but the sheriff's expression held no trace of humor. "This some kind of local tradition?" I asked. "Halloween pranks that got out of hand?" My grandfather wrote that list, Boudreau said, lighting a cigarette with hands that barely trembled. His grandfather told it to him. Every family that's been here more than 50 years has a copy. He exhaled smoke that hung in the humid air like a warning. The new folks, the ones who moved here in the last decade or two, they learn quick or they leave. Sometimes they don't get the chance to choose. A mosquito whined near my ear. I slapped at it, the sound sharp in the quiet night. Sheriff, I'm here to investigate a murder, not... The body you're about to see broke 3 of these rules, he interrupted. Maybe 4. Hard to tell with what's left. Who was the victim? Jean-Baptiste Hébert. 28. Worked offshore 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. This was his off week. Boudreau dropped his cigarette, grinding it under his boot. His cousin found him this morning when he didn't show for their fishing trip. Hebert, I said, related to the priest who disappeared. Boudreau's jaw tightened. Nephew. That family's had nothing but sorrow since the church closed. So before we go further into this story, I would like to inform the viewers that I now post 2 stories on alternate days. I hope you enjoy more frequent uploads. For our channel members, the second story is uploaded a few hours in advance. Click the join button to become a member. Also, if you'd like to share one of your stories or would like to be featured in a story, you can comment, so or share the story on our own subreddit in the description. That's all. Now let's continue with the story. Jean-Baptiste was trying to get permission from the diocese to reopen it, bring in a new priest from Lafayette. We drove toward the mill in separate vehicles, my rental sedans struggling through potholes filled with yesterday's rain. The town proper consisted of 24 buildings clustered around what used to be Main Street, now just called the Road by locals. Every house we passed had salt lines at the doorways, fresh and white in my headlights. Blue bottles hung from porch ceilings, softly clinking in the breeze. The Melançon sugar mill squatted at the town's eastern edge, a rust-eaten monument to better times. The building hadn't processed cane since 1963, when a fire killed 7 workers and old man Melançon himself. Locals said you could still smell burnt sugar on humid nights, though the scientists from LSU who investigated claimed it was just swamp gas. Yellow tape surrounded the entrance, the only modern thing in sight. Deputy Arsenault, and yes, that Arsenault, one of the old families, stood guard, his flashlight beams sweeping nervous arcs across the ground. "Evening, detective," he said, his Cajun accent thick as rue. "Sheriff, you tell him about the counting?" "Rule 2, I said, showing I'd paid attention. Arsenault nodded approval. "Good. Jean-Baptiste, he forgot to count, or maybe counted wrong. My grandmère, she always said the mill keeps its own time, and 3:33 comes whether you're ready or not." Inside, industrial machinery loomed in the darkness, conveyor belts and grinding wheels frozen mid-motion for 60 years. Our flashlights painted shadows that seemed to lag behind their sources, but I chalked that up to tired eyes and bad coffee. The snow hit before we reached the body, not decay, but burnt sugar mixed with something metallic. Sweet and wrong, like candy coated in blood. "Through here," Boudreau said, leading me deeper into the mill's bowels. Jean-Baptiste Hébert had been arranged. That was the only word for it. His body sat in the center of the old, grinding floor, positioned on a wooden chair that didn't belong to this century. Arms folded in his lap, head tilted back toward the ceiling where rusted chains dangled like Spanish moss made of metal. His eyes were gone, not torn out, but carefully removed, the sockets packed with what looked like crystallized sugar. "Jesus Christ," I breathed. my flashlight beam catching the sugar crystals. They sparkled like broken glass. "Don't take the Lord's name," Arsenault said quickly, crossing himself. "Not here. The mill remembers everything said within its walls. I'd seen bodies mutilated by boats, by alligators, by humans doing their worst to other humans. This was different. This was staged with the kind of care you'd use to set a dinner table for important guests." "When did the cousin find him?" I asked, pulling on latex gloves. "Theo found him at 7:15 this morning," Boudreau said, "but based on the blood pooling and the sugar." He paused, struggling with something. "The sugar crystallization suggests he died at exactly 3:33 a.m. I knelt beside the body. Jean-Baptiste wore work clothes, Carhartt pants, steel-toed boots, a faded LSU Tigers t-shirt. No defensive wounds on his hands, no signs of struggle. The sugar in his eye sockets had formed perfect geometric patterns, like frost on a window, but sweeter, wronger. "You said he broke 3 rules," I prompted, photographing the scene from multiple angles. My camera flash seemed dimmer than it should be, as if the darkness here ate light. Boudreau consulted a small notebook. "His truck was found on the Old Parish Road at 12:47 a.m. That's Melançon family territory after midnight, so that's Rule 6 broken. Witnesses at Guidry's bar say he was taking pictures of the cypress trees near Beauregard Cemetery around 11 p.m. Rule 7. And the third?" "The counting," Arsenault interjected. "My cousin Marie lives in the shotgun house nearest the mill. She heard the grinding start at 3:33, just like always. Then she heard screaming. Not in French, detective. In English. He didn't count. Or couldn't." I stood, my knees protesting. "You're telling me this man was killed because he took some pictures and drove on the wrong road?" "I'm telling you what happened," Boudreau said carefully. "The why of it. That's been Mare Noir's question since before my time." Something dripped in the darkness beyond our flashlight beams. The sound echoed wrong, like water falling up instead of down. I made myself focus on the evidence, on procedure, on things that made sense in courtrooms and police reports. "I need to talk to this Theo, the cousin. And anyone else who saw Jean-Baptiste last night?" "Theo's at his mother's house," Boudreau said. "Won't come out after dark, not since he found the body. The others who saw Jean-Baptiste." "Detective, you need to understand something. People here, they'll talk to you during daylight. But once that sun starts setting, doors close and they won't open for anyone, not even law enforcement." I checked my watch. 4:17 p.m. The summer sun would hold until around 8 p.m., giving me less than 4 hours. "There's more," Arsenault said reluctantly. He led us to the wall behind the body. What I'd taken for water damage in the darkness revealed itself as writing under direct light. Words carved deep into the wood, in what looked like French, but older, different. The dialect my grandmère spoke when she thought no one was listening. "Celui qui oublie les anciennes façons nourrit les anciennes faim. He who forgets the old ways feeds the old hungers. This wasn't here yesterday," Boudreau said. "I check the mill every week, make sure teenagers aren't using it for parties or worse. This is fresh." I ran my gloved finger along the carved letters. The wood was still damp, not with water, but with something viscous, sticky. It smelled like cane syrup mixed with copper pennies. "We need to seal this scene completely," I said. "No one in or out. And I want..." The grinding started. Not all at once, but slowly, like an old engine trying to turn over. Metal scraping against metal. Gears that hadn't moved in 60 years suddenly remembering their purpose. The sound filled the mill, mechanical and hungry. I looked at my watch. 3:33 p.m. That's not possible, I said. The rule says 3:33 a.m., not... The mill keeps its own time, Arsenault said, already backing toward the door. Sometimes it runs fast, sometimes slow, but when it grinds, you count. The sound grew louder, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Without thinking, I found myself counting in the French my grand-mère taught me. 1, 2, 3. Boudreau and Arsenault joined in, our voices creating a strange harmony with the grinding machinery. The air grew thick with the smell of burning sugar, so strong I could taste it on my tongue. My shadow, cast by the flashlight, seemed to sway independently of my body. We reached 43 just as the grinding stopped. In the silence that followed, Jean-Baptiste's body had changed position. Subtle, but unmistakable. His head now faced forward instead of back, and his folded hands had shifted, one finger pointing toward the carved message on the wall. "We should go," Boudreau said, his professional composure finally cracking. "Come back tomorrow with a full team, daylight." I wanted to argue, to insist we process the scene properly. But the sugar in Jean-Baptiste's sockets had started to melt, running down his cheeks like crystalline tears. Whatever pretense of normalcy I'd been clinging to dissolved with it. We left the mill quickly but carefully, not running, but not dawdling either. Outside, the Louisiana sun felt like salvation, even with its oppressive heat. Deputy Arsenault locked the mill doors with a chain that looked far too new, far too heavy for an abandoned building. "There's a motel on the parish line," Boudreau said, "the Ace of Spades. It's outside town limits, so the rules, they're softer there. Madame Savoie runs it. She'll be expecting you." "How could she be expecting me?" Boudreau and Arsenault exchanged looks. "Marée Noire always knows when outsiders arrive," Arsenault said. "The town, it watches, it weighs, it decides if you're worthy of its secrets, or if you become one of them." The Ace of Spades motel squatted beside Highway 315, like a toad made of cinder blocks and regret. 12 rooms, each door painted a different faded color, with a neon sign missing half its letters. The office occupied what used to be a British petroleum station, the old pumps still standing guard like rusted sentinels. Madame Savoie waited behind bulletproof glass that hadn't been there in the 1960s when the place was built. She was somewhere between 70 and eternity, wearing a house dress the color of a weak coffee and jewelry that looked older than Louisiana itself. "Detective Landry," she said before I could introduce myself. "Room 7 is ready, paid through Thursday." She slid a key, an actual key, not a card, through the slot. "You'll want to speak with Theo Hebert before the sun gets much lower. He's at the yellow house past the water tower, waiting." "Who paid for the room?" Her smile revealed gold teeth. "The town takes care of its necessities, detective. Jean-Baptiste's death has disturbed things. Balance must be restored." "You knew him?" "I delivered him," she said. 30 years ago, back when I was the midwife here. Caught babies for all the old families. Jean-Baptiste came out silent. Didn't cry for 3 full minutes. His grand-mère said it meant he'd see things others couldn't. She adjusted her glasses, thick as mason jar bottoms. Seemed she was right. I pocketed the key. "What kind of things did he see?" "The kind that made him want to reopen that church. Foolboy thought God could override older contracts." She turned back to her small television, where a game show played on mute. "You've got maybe 3 hours of good daylight. Best to use them wisely." The yellow house sat in a part of town that felt older than the rest, where the roads were still made of crushed shells and oyster fragments. Theo Hebert answered before I could knock, as if he'd been standing at the door waiting. He had Jean-Baptiste's same angular face, but aged by grief and something else. Knowledge, maybe. "Detective," he said, voice hoarse. "Come in, quick." The house smelled of coffee and frankincense. Every doorway had a small bundle of herbs tied above it, and mirrors faced every window. Theo led me to a kitchen where the table was covered in photographs, documents, and what looked like Jean-Baptiste's research. He knew something would happen, Theo said, pouring coffee thick as motor oil into 2 cups. Started gathering all this about a month ago, right after he petitioned the diocese. I examined the papers. Photocopies of church records dating back to 1887, land deeds, death certificates. A pattern emerged in the documentation. Every 30 years, give or take, someone in Marais Noir died in the mill. Always at 3:33. Always arranged. 1893, Augustin Melançon, I read. 1923, Marie Trosclair. 1953, Joseph Arsenault. 1983-. Father Hebert, Theo finished. My uncle. Though they never found his body, just his shoes. And now, 2023, Jean-Baptiste. I set down the papers. Every 30 years. Except there were others, Theo said, pulling out a folder marked with a cross. People who broke the rules. Outsiders mostly. Folks passing through who didn't listen or didn't believe. Those don't follow the pattern. Those are just appetite. He showed me newspaper clippings, missing persons reports, travel advisories, a story from 1998 about a documentary crew that vanished while filming Louisiana's Forgotten Towns. Their equipment was found in the mill, cameras still recording nothing but darkness and the sound of grinding. Jean-Baptiste thought if he could reopen the church, consecrate the ground again, it might stop, Theo continued. The old families, they made some kind of deal back when the town was founded. During the yellow fever epidemic of 1878, when everyone was dying. The sickness stopped here. Not a single death after the deal was made. What kind of deal? Theo walked to the window, checking the sun's position. The kind you make when you're desperate and you've buried too many children. The kind that seems like salvation until you realize you've just traded one horror for another. A car pulled up outside. Sheriff Boudreau's cruiser. He entered without knocking, face grim. "We've got a problem," he said. "Madame Trosclair is walking the roads. It's still daylight, but she's out there, asking everyone what year it is." Theo's face drained of color. She never walks during the day. Never. "Who is Madame Trosclair?" I asked. "She died in 1953, Boudreau said. "But she keeps forgetting. Rule 3 exists because of her. When she forgets what year it is, she forgets she's dead. And when she forgets she's dead, she gets hungry," Theo whispered. "Just like the warning says." Through the window, I saw her. An elderly woman in a sun-faded dress walking down the middle of the road, stopping at each house, knocking on doors. From this distance, she looked normal, just confused. But something about her movement was wrong. Too smooth, like she was gliding rather than walking. "What happens if someone doesn't tell her the year?" I asked. "Nobody's ever refused," Boudreau said. "Nobody's that stupid." She was 3 houses away now. 2. I could see her more clearly. The dress wasn't sun-faded. It was the same dress from the 1953 newspaper photo Theo had shown me, the one she died in. Her skin had a translucent quality, like wax paper held up to light. She knocked on Theo's door. Theo looked at me, then at Boudreau. "You answer it," he said to me. You're the outsider. She needs to know you're here, that you're investigating. Maybe it'll help." I opened the door. Madame Trosclair stood on the porch, smiling pleasantly. Up close, I could see through her slightly, like looking at a reflection in dirty water. Her eyes were the worst part, clouded with cataracts that had been growing for 70 years. "Good evening," she said, voice like wind through sugarcane. "Could you tell me what year it is? I seem to have forgotten." "It's 2023, I said. Her smile widened, and I saw too many teeth, layers of them like a shark's mouth. "Oh my," she said. "I've been gone a long time, haven't I? And you're new. How nice. Are you here about the boy in the mill?" "Yes, ma'am." "He should have counted," she said, already turning away. "They always should count. The mill remembers everything, you know. Every grain of sugar, every drop of blood, every broken promise." She paused at the gate. "You'll want to talk to the Melançon heir. She's the last one who remembers the original deal. Lives in the White House at the end of Cypress Street. But don't go after dark, detective. She doesn't receive visitors after dark." She continued down the road, fading slightly with each step, until she was just a shimmer in the heat haze. Then nothing. "Every time," Theo said, shakily lighting a cigarette. "Every time she appears, someone dies within the week. Last time was right before Uncle Francis had his accident at the refinery." I checked my watch. 6:47 p.m. The sun sat low, painting everything the color of old blood. "This Melançon heir," I said. "I need to see her." "Delphine Melançon," Boudreau said. 93 years old, sharp as a cane knife. But detective, you've got maybe an hour before sunset, and trust me, you don't want to be caught on Cypress Street after dark. That's where Rule 4 matters most. The fireflies that aren't fireflies? They're the souls of the workers who died in the mill fire, Fayot said. Or that's what my grandmère claimed. They lead people past the cemetery gates, into the swamp. The bodies turn up weeks later, covered in burns that look 60 years old. The White House at the end of Cypress Street looked like it had been painted with bones. 3 stories of antebellum architecture that predated the Civil War, with galleries wrapped around each floor and columns that seemed to hold up more than just the roof. The lawn was perfect, despite the heat. Emerald green where everything else had turned brown from the Louisiana summer. I parked at the iron gate as the sun touched the tree line. 40 minutes, maybe less, before dark. Delphine Levançon answered the door herself. If she was 93, the years had made a negotiated settlement rather than taking their full toll. She stood straight-backed in a cream-colored dress, her white hair pinned in a style that went out of fashion with Kennedy's inauguration. Her eyes were the pale blue of shallow water over sand. "Detective Landry," she said, not a question. "I've been expecting you since Jean-Baptiste started his foolish crusade. Come in. We have little time." The house interior belonged to a museum. Persian rugs, oil paintings of stern ancestors, furniture that looked like it would bruise you for sitting wrong. She led me to a study where the walls were covered floor to ceiling with ledgers, journals, and maps of the parish dating back 2 centuries. "Tea?" she offered, already pouring from a service that probably cost more than my yearly salary. "It's my own blend. Sassafras and something else you won't identify." The tea tasted of root and earth and faintly of iron. I set it down carefully. "You know why I'm here. You're here because Jean-Baptiste thought he could break a contract written in fever and signed in blood," she said, settling into a wingback chair that made her look like a queen on a throne. "My family built this town, detective. when others were dying by the dozens in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Lafayette. We survived. We paid the price for that survival. She stood, moving to a wall safe hidden behind a portrait of a man who shared her sharp cheekbones. The combination took her 3 tries, her fingers not as steady as her voice. From inside, she pulled out a leather journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. August 17th, 1878, she read. The fever has taken 17 more since Sunday. The cemetery cannot hold them all. Children are stacked like cordwood awaiting burial. Catherine, my great-great-grandmother, has lost 3 sons in as many days. She turned the page with reverent care. August 19th, 1878. The old woman from the swamp came again. She speaks of bargains, of old gods that predate the cross. She says the fever is just hunger, and hunger can be redirected. Augustine, my great-great-grandfather, has agreed to meet with her at the mill tonight. The room had grown darker, shadows pooling in corners despite the electric lights. Through the window, I could see the sun was now just a sliver on the horizon. What did they agree to? I asked. Survival, Delphine said simply. The fever would pass over Marais Noir. In exchange, the town would provide sustenance. Every 30 years, one of the founding families would offer someone. The mill would grind, the hunger would be fed, and the town would continue. Human sacrifice. Such a crude term. She closed the journal. Think of it as rent, detective. We live on land that was never meant for the living. The swamp wants to reclaim everything, always has. This bargain keeps it at bay. And the rules? Additional terms, she said. The entity, call it what you will, has peculiar needs. It requires respect for the old boundaries, acknowledgement of the dead who serve it, proper counting during its feeding times. Break these smaller rules, and it takes payment outside the agreed schedule. A clock somewhere in the house chimed 7:30. The sun was gone, leaving only an orange smear on the horizon. You should go, Delphine said, but I was already standing. Wait, I said. How do I stop this? How do we end the contract? She laughed, a sound like glass breaking in velvet. End it? Detective, without the contract, Marais Noir returns to the swamp in a matter of days. The roads crack, the foundations sink, the water rises. We tried to leave once, in 1941. The entire Broussard family packed up, drove for the parish line. Their car was found the next morning in the middle of Main Street, doors sealed shut from the inside. Everyone inside aged 30 years in a single night. Through the window, lights began to appear in the yard, soft yellow-green, dancing between the oak trees. Fireflies, except fireflies don't move with purpose, don't form procession lines, don't pulse in unison like a heartbeat. Go, Delphine said, urgent now. Out the back, through the kitchen. Your car won't start. Electronics fail after sunset near this house. Run to the road, stay on the pavement. Don't look back. The motel is 2 miles. You can make it if you don't stop. I wanted to argue, to demand more answers. But the lights were getting closer, and I could hear something that might have been singing, or might have been screaming, pitched too high for human throats. The kitchen door opened onto a back garden where every plant grew in perfect rows, tomatoes and okra, and things I didn't recognize, all thriving despite the killing heat. The moment I stepped outside, my rental car's headlights died. The engine gave one cough and went silent. I ran. The pavement was still warm under my feet as I sprinted down Cypress Street. Behind me, those lights rose like a glowing cloud, and I could smell burning sugar so strong it made my eyes water. Something called my name. Not my voice, but my mother's. Dead these past 5 years. I didn't turn around. Rule 1. Don't acknowledge anyone who calls your name, unless you can see their feet. The street stretched longer than it should have. Each house I passed was shuttered tight, not a single light showing despite the early evening hour. Television sounds came from within, canned laughter and game show bells, but muffled like they were playing underwater. Something ran alongside me in the drainage ditch, keeping pace. I caught glimpses of movement, heard splashing that didn't match any animal I knew. When it laughed, the sound was like grinding metal. A figure stood in the road ahead, Madame Trosclair, still in her death dress, still smiling with too many teeth. "What year is it?" she asked. 2023, I gasped out, not slowing down. She stepped aside. "Good boy. Lenoa's hungry tonight. Best you keep running." The 2 miles felt like 20. By the time I stumbled into the Ace of Spades parking lot, my shirt was soaked through with sweat and my legs felt like water. Madame Savoie stood in the office doorway, holding it open. "Cutting it close, detective," she said as I collapsed into a plastic chair. "Delphine must have kept you late. She does that sometimes, forgets not everyone has her protections." "Protections?" "The founding families can't be taken outside the arrangement," she explained, locking the door and pulling down a metal shutter I hadn't noticed before. "They made the deal. They're exempt from the casual hunger, but you're just meat that hasn't been eaten yet." She poured me water from a pitcher that had ice cubes shaped like crescents. Jean-Baptiste thought he could break the contract by bringing the church back. Thought maybe God's house would override the older claim. Instead, he just made himself the perfect offering. A Hebert descendant trying to break the very deal that saved his bloodline. So he was murdered by this entity. "Murdered is the wrong word," Madame Savoie said. "He was collected. The mill took what was owed just 30 years early. The real question, detective, is who made sure Jean-Baptiste would be at the mill at exactly 3:33 a.m. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every sound outside my motel room door might have been footsteps, or might have been something pretending to have feet. Around 2 a.m., something knocked. 3 sets of 3, perfectly spaced. I didn't answer. At 3:33, I heard the distant sound of grinding metal, and counted to 43 in French, even though I was miles from the mill. Dawn came like forgiveness, slow and uncertain through the yellowed curtains. My phone had 17 missed calls from the state police headquarters, but no signal to return them. The landline in the motel office rang busy every time I tried. Madame Savoie brought coffee and beignets to my room without being asked, setting them on the small table by the window. "You need to speak with Armand Broussard," she said without preamble. "He's the only one of the old families who opposed reopening the church. He and Jean-Baptiste had words at Guidry's bar 2 nights before the death." Why didn't Sheriff Boudreau mention this? She gave me a look that suggested I was being deliberately dense. Boudreau is an arsenault on his mother's side. The old families protect their own, even when they shouldn't. Where do I find Broussard? He runs the morning shift at the boat launch. Been there since 4 a.m. like always. Creatures of habit, the Broussards. His grandfather was the same way, until the water took him in '69. The boat launch sat where the town met the bayou, a concrete slope disappearing into brown water that moved without current. Armand Broussard was built like a man who'd spent 40 years hauling boats and crab traps. Thick arms, permanent sunburn, hands that could probably crush a beer can without trying. He didn't look up when I approached, just kept working on an outboard motor that had seen better decades. "Detective, he said to the motor. "Wondered when you'd come." "You argued with Jean-Baptiste." I told him the truth. He set down his wrench, finally meeting my eyes. His were green as swamp water and just as murky. That boy thought he could pray away a bargain sealed in blood and fever. I told him he'd just make things worse. How could it be worse than human sacrifice every 30 years? Armand laughed, bitter as black coffee. "You city folk, you think in such simple terms. You know what this land was before the bargain? Nothing. Swamp and fever, quicksand and gators. The Kitamachas who lived here before us, they knew better than to build permanent settlements. They passed through, paid their respects to the old spirits, and moved on." He pulled out a flask, took a drink, offered it to me. Whiskey, with something herbal underneath. "My family wanted to leave in 41, he continued. "You heard about that? What Delphine didn't tell you is that 3 other families tried to leave over the years. The Landrys in 58, no relation to you, I checked. The Thibodeaux in 77, the Gautreaux in 91. Want to know what happened to them?" I waited. "They're still here," he said, pointing toward the bayou. "Down there in the mud. Sometimes, on still nights, you can hear them trying to claw their way back up. The town doesn't let go, detective. It's in our blood now, literal as cancer." "Tell me about the night Jean-Baptiste died." His jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "I was at Guidry's until midnight. Jean-Baptiste came in around 10, already 3 drinks deep, talking about signs from God and breaking chains of bondage. College boy nonsense he learned at LSU. I told him to leave it alone, and he said I was a coward. Said the old families had Stockholm Syndrome, protecting the thing that enslaved us. Maybe he was right." Armand spat into the water. "But being right doesn't make you smart. He left the bar at 11:15, said he was going to document everything, prove the town was built on murder. The photographs at the cemetery. Not just there. He went to the mill first, around midnight. Took pictures of the grinding room, the walls, everything. Posted them online to some forum about Louisiana mysteries. Then he drove through Melançon territory, probably heading home. But he didn't make it home." "No." Armand's hands clenched. "Someone called him. I know because his phone records will show it when you check. Someone told him to come back to the mill at 3 a.m. Told him something that made him go." "Who?" "Check the records," he said again, turning back to his motor. "But detective, ask yourself this. Who benefits from Jean-Baptiste's death? Who needs the contract to continue?" I left him at the boat launch and drove to the sheriff's station, a converted feed store that still smelled faintly of grain. Boudreau was there, looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. Deputy Arsenault sat at a desk, typing on a computer that belonged in the museum. "I need Jean-Baptiste's phone records," I said. Boudreau wordlessly handed me a folder. Inside were printouts from the phone company, time-stamped and highlighted. The last call Jean-Baptiste received was at 2:47 a.m. from a number registered to the St. Augustine Catholic Church, the abandoned church his uncle had served. "That's impossible," Arsenault said, reading over my shoulder. "That church hasn't had phone service since '98. "Someone wanted him at that mill," I said. "Someone who knew he'd come if he thought it involved the church. Or something," Boudreau said quietly. "Detective, there's something else. This morning when I went to check the mill, the body was different." He showed me Polaroid photos. He said digital cameras malfunctioned too often near the mill. Jean-Baptiste's corpse had changed. The sugar in his eye sockets had formed into perfect crosses. His hands, previously folded, now held rosary beads that hadn't been there before. Beads that Boudreau recognized. "Those belonged to Father Hebert," he said. "They were buried with his shoes when we gave up looking for the body." I studied the photos. Something else was different. Writing had appeared on Jean-Baptiste's exposed skin. Latin phrases burned into the flesh like brands, but without any sign of heat damage. "Sanguis pro sanguine," I read. "Foedus aeternum." Blood for blood. Eternal covenant. "The mill is making a point," Arsenault said, crossing himself. "The contract stands." My phone buzzed, the first signal I'd had in hours. A text from an unknown number. Cemetery. Midnight. Come alone, or the truth stays buried. TH. TH. T.O. Hebert? Or something else using his initials? The rest of the day passed in a blur of interviews that went nowhere. The people of Marais Noir had perfected the art of talking without saying anything. Yes, they knew Jean-Baptiste. No, they didn't know who would want him dead. Yes, they followed the rules. No, they didn't question why. As evening approached, I made a decision that probably violated every protocol in the book. I went to the cemetery before sunset to scout it, to understand the layout before darkness made everything hostile. Beauregard Cemetery stretched across 3 acres of slightly elevated ground, the only place in Marais Noir where water didn't seep through immediately. The graves dated back to the 1820s, with the founding families occupying elaborate crypts near the center. The Hebert section was modest by comparison. Simple headstones and 1 larger monument for Father Hebert, though his body wasn't beneath it. The iron fence mentioned in Rule 4 was real, painted black and topped with fleur-de-lis spikes. Beyond it, the swamp began immediately, cypress trees standing in dark water like mourners at a wake. As the sun lowered, I saw the first lights appear. Soft, green gold, beautiful if you didn't know better. I returned to the motel to wait for midnight. Madame Savoie said nothing when I told her my plan, just handed me a small cloth bag that smelled of sage and something sharper. "Gris-gris," she said. "Won't stop anything determined, but might make them think twice." At 11:45, I drove to the cemetery. The gates stood open, though I was certain they'd been locked at sunset. My flashlight beam seemed smaller here, as if the darkness was thicker, heavier. The path to the Hebert section was lined with offerings, flowers, coins, small bottles of rum. Fresh offerings, still wet with evening dew. A figure stood by Father Hebert's monument. Not Theo. Too tall, too still. As I approached, it turned, and I saw a face that belonged in old photographs, wearing a priest collar that had been white 30 years ago. "You're early, detective," Father Hebert said with a voice like wind through empty rooms. "But then, punctuality is appreciated in our line of work." "You're dead," I said stupidly. "Am I?" He touched his own face with translucent fingers. "Yes, I suppose I am. But death is negotiable in Marais Noir, as you've learned. I've been waiting 30 years to speak with someone who might listen." "You killed your nephew." "No." The word carried the weight of decades. "I tried to save him. The message, the call. That was me, or what's left of me. I wanted to warn him. Instead, I became the bait that drew him to his death. The mill uses us even in death, detective. We're puppet strings in its horrible design." Behind him, more figures emerged from between the crypts. Madame Trosclair, looking more solid in the moonlight. Others I recognized from old photographs in the newspaper archives. The dead of Marais Noir, the ones who'd broken rules or paid the price. "We're going to tell you the truth," Father Hebert said. about the bargain, about what really lives in the mill, and about the only way to break the contract. But detective, once you know, you become part of it. There's no walking away with this knowledge. The town will either claim you or use you. I thought about Jean-Baptiste's body arranged in that chair, about the 30-year cycle of death, about all the rules designed to keep something satisfied. "Tell me," I said. Father Hebert led us deeper into the cemetery, past crypts that bore names I'd been hearing for days. The dead followed in a procession that made no sound, their feet never quite touching the ground. We stopped at a section I hadn't noticed during my earlier visit, a circular clearing where no grass grew, the earth packed hard as concrete and dark as old blood. "This is where it started," Father Hebert said, gesturing to the barren ground. Not in 1878 with the yellow fever, but in 1823, when the first French settlers tried to build here. Madame Trosclair drifted forward, her voice carrying the accent of centuries past. "My ancestor, Guillaume Trosclair, led the expedition. 20 families seeking land, far from New Orleans politics and disease. They found this place where the bayou bends back on itself, where the water runs in circles during certain moons. The other ghosts arranged themselves in a rough circle, and I noticed their positions matched worn indentations in the ground, spots where people had stood many times before. There was already something here," Father Hebert continued. "The Kitimakas called it the Hungry Dark, though that's just the closest translation. It's older than human memory, older than Mames. It fed on the swamp itself, the slow decay, the cycle of growth and rot, the small deaths that keep the bayou alive. A ghost I didn't recognize, wearing the rough clothes of a laborer, spoke up. The first settlers disturbed it. They drained the swamp, built the mill, tried to impose order on chaos. The thing woke up angry, and 20 people died in 3 days. Not from fever or sickness. They just emptied out, like something drank them dry from the inside." "So Guillaume made a deal," Madame Trosclair said, her too many teeth catching moonlight. "Feed it properly, at regular intervals, and it would sleep between feedings. Let the town prosper. The mill would be its shrine. The grinding would be its prayer. And blood would be its communion." I pulled out my notebook, trying to document this, even as my hand shook. "But the 30-year cycle, that came later," Father Hebert said. "At first they fed it criminals, drifters, anyone who wouldn't be missed. But the thing grew, particular. It wanted connection, investment. It wanted sacrifice that meant something. So, in 1878, when the yellow fever came, the families formalized the arrangement. One of their own, every 30 years, chosen by lot. Except that's not how Jean-Baptiste was chosen, I said. No. Father Hebert's form flickered like bad reception. Someone changed the rules. Someone who needs the contract to continue, but didn't want to wait for the lottery. A new voice came from behind me. I turned to find Theo Heber approaching, very much alive, but looking haggard. Sheriff Boudreau walked beside him, hand on his service weapon. "Theo?" I said. "Your text." "I didn't send any text," Theo said. "Sheriff Boudreau found me at home, told me you'd come here, said it was time for the truth." Father Hebert's ghost studied his living nephew with eyes that held 30 years of sorrow. "Then you know." "I've known since I found Jean-Baptiste," Theo said, not looking at the ghost directly. The way he was positioned, the sugar in his eyes. Only someone who knew the old rites could have done that. Someone who wanted to make sure the sacrifice was accepted. Boudreau cleared his throat. "Detective, There's something you need to understand. The lottery for the next sacrifice was held last month, in secret, by the old families. The chosen one was Delphine Melançon. The pieces clicked together in my mind. She's 93. She would have died naturally soon anyway, so she changed the game, Theo finished, offered the entity something it wanted more, a Hebert trying to break the contract. Jean-Baptiste's death wasn't just a sacrifice. It was a message. The contract stands, and anyone who tries to break it becomes the next offering. The ghosts stirred, agitated. Madame Trosclair's form became more solid, more present. "But there is a way," she said urgently. "Father Hebert found it before he died. Tell them, Father." The ghostly priest moved to the center of the barren circle. "The entity isn't evil, not in the way we understand evil. It's hungry. It's always been hungry. But hunger can be redirected, transformed. The mill doesn't have to grind blood. It could grind something else." "What else?" I asked. "Memory," he said simply. "Feed it the town's history, its stories, its accumulated guilt and sorrow. Let it feast on the past instead of the future. But to do that, someone would have to enter the mill at 3:33 during the grinding and offer themselves as a conduit. They'd survive, probably, but they'd carry the weight of every death, every sacrifice, every broken rule." "You tried this," I said, understanding flooding through me. 30 years ago, you tried to be that conduit." "I failed," Father Hebert admitted. "I wasn't strong enough. Or maybe I was too afraid. The entity took me anyway, but incompletely. That's why my body was never found. I'm stuck between feeding and being fed upon." Boudreau's radio crackled. Deputy Arsenault's voice, panicked. "Sheriff, we've got a problem. Delphine Melançon is at the mill. She's starting the grinding manually." We ran, the living and the dead, through cemetery gates that shouldn't have been open, down roads that seemed to stretch and contract with our urgency. The mill loomed against the night sky, and even from a distance, we could hear it. The mechanical grinding, but also something else. Singing. Multiple voices in harmony, in languages that predated French, English, or anything else spoken by human tongues. The mill's doors stood open. Inside, every piece of machinery was moving, even ones that hadn't been connected to power sources for 60 years. The air was thick with the smell of burning sugar and something else. Ozone, like the air before a lightning strike. Delphine Melançon stood in the center of the grinding floor, in the exact spot where Jean-Baptiste's body had been found. She'd drawn symbols on the floor in what looked like molasses mixed with blood. The grinding stones above her head spun faster than should have been possible, creating a vortex of sound and motion. "It's not 3:33, I shouted over the noise. She turned to us, and her face was serene, almost joyful. "Time is negotiable, detective. I'm 93 years old. I've been keeping this town's books since before you were born. I know every loophole, every clause, every subcategory of the contract." "You killed Jean-Baptiste," Theo accused, stepping forward. "I guided him to his purpose," she corrected. "He wanted to serve God? Well, he served something older and hungrier. His death fed the entity for another 30 years. My death tonight will feed it for 100. "Why?" Boudreau demanded. "Because I love this town," she said simply. "My family built it, nurtured it, protected it. I won't let it return to the swamp. I won't let the roads crack and the foundations sink. Marais Noir will survive, even if it has to survive as a monument to necessary evil." The grinding grew louder, and the ghosts around us became more solid, more real. Father Hebert stepped forward, his form now completely opaque. "Delphine, this isn't the way. Let me show you what I learned. We can redirect the hunger, transform it." "Into what?" she laughed. "A tourist attraction? A case study for anthropologists? No, the old ways are the only ways that work." She pulled out an antique revolver, pearl-handled and gleaming. "The contract requires willing sacrifice. I'm 93, detective. I'm tired. I've kept the ledgers, maintained the balance, arranged the offerings. Jean-Baptiste was my last official act. This is my retirement." "Don't!" I started, but she wasn't pointing the gun at herself. She aimed it at the grinding stones above, at specific points I hadn't noticed before. Metal joints that held the entire mechanism together. "Did you know," she said conversationally, "that if the mill stops grinding during the feeding, the entity doesn't just wake up. It gets free. Completely. Permanently free." The ghosts recoiled. Even Father Hebert stepped back. "That's the real secret, detective," Delphine continued. "We're not feeding it to keep it satisfied. We're feeding it to keep it contained. The grinding trap it, the sacrifice soothes it, and the rules are bars on its cage." She fired. The bullet struck true, and one of the grinding stones lurched, its rhythm breaking. The sound that came from the mill's depths wasn't mechanical. It was organic, alive, and furious. 30 seconds, Delphine said calmly, checking her watch. "In 30 seconds, either someone takes my place in the circle, or the entity gets free. Your choice, detective. Save the town by becoming its keeper, or let it return to the swamp it came from." The symbols on the floor began to glow, and through them, I could see something rising. Darkness that had weight, hunger that had form. The darkness rising through Delphine's symbols had texture, wet and heavy like tar, but moving with purpose. It pushed against the breaking machinery above us, testing the weakening cage of sound and motion. 20 seconds left, maybe less. "I'll do it," Theo said, stepping toward the circle. "Jean-Baptiste was my cousin, my blood. This should be my burden." "No," Sheriff Boudreaux grabbed his arm. "I'm sworn to protect this town. That includes protecting it from itself." Father Hebert's ghost moved between them. "Neither of you understand what this means. To become the keeper isn't just standing in a circle. It's becoming part of the mechanism itself. You'll live, but you'll never leave. Every grinding, every feeding, you'll feel it pass through you." 15 seconds. The darkness had started to take shape. Not a form exactly, but an impression of vast appetite, of consumption without satisfaction. The remaining grinding stones screamed against their bearings, sparks showering down like hellish rain. "There's another way," I said, the words coming from somewhere deeper than thought. "Delphine said the contract requires willing sacrifice. But what if we refuse? All of us. What if we let it go?" "The town dies," Delphine said, her calm cracking for the first time. "Everything we built, everyone who lives here, lives under a curse," I finished. "Lives in fear, counting in French, avoiding their own shadows. That's not life. That's just slower death." 10 seconds. The entity pushed harder, and I felt its attention turn to us. Not eyes, because it didn't need eyes. It knew us by our heat, our movement, our stubborn insistence on existing in its domain. Deputy Arsenault appeared in the doorway, breathing hard. "The whole town's awake. They're coming." Through the mill's broken windows, I could see lights approaching. Flashlights, lanterns, phone screens. The people of Marais Noir, drawn by the grinding, by the breaking of routine that had defined their lives for generations. 5 seconds. "Choose," Delphine commanded. but her voice had lost its authority. She was just an old woman with a gun, standing in a circle of molasses and blood, trying to hold together something that had been broken from the start. I made my choice. I stepped not into the circle but across it, breaking the symbols with my feet. The mixture of blood and molasses splattered, destroying the careful geometry Delphine had created. "No!" she screamed, raising the gun toward me. The grinding stopped. In the silence that followed, the entity rose fully into our world. It wasn't darkness. Darkness is just the absence of light. This was presence, dense and undeniable. It filled the mill from floor to rafters, and we were insects caught in amber made of hunger. But then something else happened. The ghosts, Father Hebert, Madame Trosclair, all the dead who had been tied to the town's bargain, they didn't flee. They moved forward into the entity, and they began to speak. Not words, but stories. Every death, every sacrifice, every small cruelty that had kept the town alive. They fed the entity not blood, but truth, not flesh, but the accumulated weight of Marenois' real history. The entity paused. For the first time in 2 centuries, something had surprised it. More townspeople pushed into the mill. I recognized faces from my interviews: store owners, fishermen, the bartender from Guidry's. They saw the entity, saw their dead relatives standing like a barrier between them and consumption, and they understood. Old Armand Broussard pushed through the crowd. "My grandfather died in this mill," he said to the darkness. 1953. He wasn't chosen by lottery. He was pushed. My grandmother pushed him because he beat her, and the town called it sacrifice to keep their secret. Others began to speak. Confessions, accusations, truths that had been buried under the weight of tradition and fear. The entity swirled, contracted, expanded, as if trying to digest this new form of offering. "It's working," Father Hebert said, his ghostly form beginning to fade. "Truth is harder to swallow than blood." Delphine fired the gun, not at me, but at the ceiling, at the last support holding the grinding stones. The machinery came apart in a cascade of rust and ruin, 60 years of decay catching up in seconds. We scattered as tons of metal crashed to the mill floor, crushing the circle, the symbols, and nearly Delphine herself if Boudreau hadn't pulled her clear at the last second. The entity convulsed. Without the grinding to contain it, without the symbols to channel it, it began to disperse. But it wasn't dying. It was spreading, seeping into the wood of the mill, the soil beneath, the water table that fed the bayou. "It's going back," Father Hebert said, his voice growing distant. "Back to what it was before we tried to cage it. Not contained, but not concentrated either. Diffuse, like morning fog, like the smell of rain before it falls." The ghosts were fading too, their purpose served, their stories told. Madame Trosclair smiled with her too many teeth one last time, before dissolving into morning mist. Because somehow, impossibly, dawn was breaking. Time had slipped again, the night compressed or extended by the breaking of the contract. Delphine sat on the floor, looking every one of her 93 years. "You've doomed us all," she said, "but there was no fire in it. The town will fade, people will leave. In 10 years, Marais Noir will just be another forgotten spot on the map." "Maybe," I said, helping her to her feet despite everything. "Or maybe it'll become something else. Something that doesn't require blood to survive." Outside, the townspeople stood in clusters, talking in low voices. Some were crying, relief or grief, I couldn't tell. Maybe both. The rules that had governed their lives for generations were broken. They were free, but freedom is its own kind of terror when you've never known it. Sheriff Boudreau looked at the ruined mill, then at me. "You know I have to arrest someone for Jean-Baptiste's murder. The state police will demand it." "Arrest me," Delphine said quietly. "I orchestrated it. I made the call from the church. I ensured he would be there at 3:33. She held out her wrists. "I'm 93 years old, detective. I doubt I'll live to see trial. But at least the truth will be in the official record." As Boudreau cuffed her, gently, more gesture than restraint, she looked back at the mill one last time. "The Chitimachas were right, you know. This was never meant to be permanent settlement. We forced permanence on a place that runs in circles, that eats itself and is reborn every season. We tried to make solid what should have stayed fluid." The sun climbed higher, and with full daylight, the mill looked like what it was: a ruin, a remnant, a monument to industrial ambition that the swamp was already beginning to reclaim. Vines that hadn't been there the night before were already creeping up the walls. The metal that had crashed down was already showing rust that looked decades old. I thought about the paperwork I'd have to file, the reports that would never quite capture what happened here. How do you explain that a murder was both a human crime and a supernatural necessity? How do you describe a town that existed in a bubble of borrowed time, feeding something older than memory? "Detective," Theo said, approaching with something in his hand. It was Jean-Baptiste's notebook, the one with his research. He would have wanted someone to know the whole truth. Not the official version, but the real one. I took the notebook. Inside, Jean-Baptiste had documented everything: the rules, the history, his growing understanding of what the town really was. His last entry, dated the night he died, was just one line: "Some prisons can only be broken from inside." Maybe he knew. Maybe he went to that mill knowing what would happen, knowing his death would begin the unraveling of the contract. Or maybe that's just what I tell myself to make sense of sacrifice. The entity was gone, or spread so thin it might as well be gone. The ghosts were at rest. The mill would collapse completely within days, taking with it the physical anchor of the town's bargain. But Marais Noir itself remained, at least for now. Changed, certainly. Free, definitely. Doomed, probably. But for the first time in 200 years, its people would face tomorrow without rules, without sacrifices, without counting to 43 in French. Whether that was salvation or another kind of hunger remained to be seen. The package arrived at my office in Baton Rouge without postage, without a return address, without any explanation for how it got past security. Just a wooden box, old and water-stained, sitting on my desk when I returned from lunch on a Tuesday, that smelled like rain. Inside, salt that had turned gray with age, a photograph I didn't remember taking, and a single page torn from the Marais Noir town registry. Population, 206. Someone had crossed it out in fresh ink and written 205. It had been 4 months since the mill collapsed, since Delphine Melançon died in parish custody before she could stand trial. Peacefully, they said, though the coroner noted the strange presence of crystallized sugar in her tear ducts. Since the state police officially closed the Jean-Baptiste Abertis as a murder-suicide, despite my protests that the timeline made no sense. I'd returned to Marais Noir once, 6 weeks after that night. The town was hemorrhaging people like a severed artery. The Broussards had left for Houston. The younger Arsenault families had scattered to Lafayette and New Orleans. Even Madame Savoie had shuttered the ace of spades, though she'd told me she wasn't leaving. Someone had to tend the graves, she said, even if the dead no longer walked. The mill was gone. Not just collapsed, but gone. As if the swamp had opened its mouth and swallowed it whole. Where it had stood, cypress trees grew that looked 50 years old. their roots twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. Sheriff Boudreau had called me last month. 3 more families had left after claiming they heard grinding sounds from beneath their floorboards at 3:33 a.m. Not the mills grinding, something earthier, older, like teeth working through soil. The photograph in the box showed the abandoned St. Augustine Catholic Church. Except the doors were open and there was light inside. Warm, golden, impossible light. In the doorway stood a figure I recognized as Jean-Baptiste, but younger, cleaner, wearing his uncle's collar. Behind him, other shapes in the light, welcoming or warning, I couldn't tell. I'd tried calling Theo after receiving the package. His number was disconnected. His social media had gone dark the day after he'd sent me a single message. The rules were never about containing it. They were about containing us. The torn registry page had names on the back, written in different hands across different decades. Every person who had died in the mill, but also others. People who had simply vanished, been erased, edited out of the town's official history. My own name was at the bottom, though I was very much alive. Below it, in parentheses, pending. That night, I dreamed of Marais Noir. Not as I'd seen it, but as it might have been, or it might yet be. Streets that ran in circles, houses that rebuilt themselves each morning in slightly different configurations, a population that counted differently depending on who was asking, and when. The entity hadn't been destroyed or contained. It had simply returned to its natural state, dispersed through the water table, the soil, the air itself. The town wasn't dying. It was transforming, becoming what it had always wanted to be, before humans tried to impose their rigid structures on it. A place where time moved like bayou water, sometimes forward, sometimes back, sometimes in circles that caught the unwary and held them forever. My phone buzzed, a text from a Louisiana number I didn't recognize. The new rules are simpler. Don't look for us. Don't speak of us. Don't remember us as we were. Remember us as we choose to be. The grinding never stopped, detective. It just learned to be quiet. I deleted the text, burned the photograph, scattered the salt. But I kept the registry page. Evidence, I told myself. Proof that Marais Noir had existed as more than just a dot on obsolete maps. Sometimes on humid nights when the air is thick enough to chew, I hear it, not grinding, but something like digestion, like the earth itself processing what it swallowed. I count to 43 in French, a habit I can't break. Last week, a new case file crossed my desk. 3 tourists vanished near Terrebonne Parish. Their rental car was found on a road that doesn't appear on any current map, pointed toward a town that officially has a population of 0. I marked the file, no jurisdiction, and passed it on. Some hungers are better left unfed, some questions are better left unasked, and some towns are better left to the mercy of the swamp that birthed them, to find their own equilibrium between the living and the dead, the real and the merely possible. Marais Noir is still there, if you know how to look for it. Or rather, if it chooses to let you find it. The rules have changed, but rules remain. They always do, in places where the ordinary world wears thin. I keep the registry page in my desk drawer, a reminder. Not of what I saw or what I survived, but of what I chose to walk away from. Every name on that list made a choice. To stay, to leave, to feed or be fed upon. My name is still there, still pending. Some nights I think about driving back, following roads that GPS denies exist, finding what remains of Marais Noir. But I remember Delphine's words about the town not letting go, about blood and contracts and hungers that transcend human understanding. Instead, I count to 43 in French and go to sleep, grateful that my shadows still move when I do, that no one calls my name without showing their feet, that the grinding I sometimes hear is probably just the air conditioner in need of repair. Probably.